Okay, so whether Adobe sticks with the name neural filters or not, there's a whole bunch of them. We're going to take a look at a filter called makeup transfer that allows you to transfer the makeup from one photograph to another. So here we are looking at a kind of calavera photograph from the Dreamstime image library, about which you can learn more and get some great deals at dreamstime.com/geek. All right, so I'm going to switch to this excellently aged fellow right here, and I'll double click on the smart filter applied to a smart object in order to bring back my neural filters. As you can see, we're currently looking at the applied filters, which includes smart portrait set to a facial age value of 50. Just in case you thought, gosh, what does surprise look like? I'll go ahead and turn that guy on. And notice it doesn't make any difference initially. That's because the value is set to 0. And that brings up an important point. I'm going to turn that option off. And now notice if I just crank that value up to 50, which is its maximum, then that does turn the option on. And it gives us a very surprised expression here inside the preview. In any event, I'm going to switch over to my beta filters, and these may be different for you, but you should see one called Makeup Transfer. Notice if you hover over that name, you're going to see some kind of thumbnail preview. And this is where I say these might be more social media filters than anything else. It's hard to take all of them seriously, but I'm going to go ahead and turn this guy on. You may have to download the filter, by the way. And I'm going to go ahead and switch my reference image to the other image that is open at this point, which is Sugar Skull. So go ahead and select this guy. We'll be able to see a preview of the image over here on the right-hand side of the screen. And then a moment or two later, we will see the makeup applied to our aged and surprised individual. At which point, I'll click OK in order to apply the effect. And we end up with this image right here, which is a heck of a time saver. We were able to create this effect with just a few clicks. And that is an example of another AI neural filter here inside Photoshop 2021. Now we'll take a look at one of the more practical of the neural filters, and this one is known as Super Zoom. And its purpose is to upsample an image. So first thing I'm going to do is turn off this Dreamstime URL. And then I'll convert this image to a smart object by double clicking on the background here inside the layers panel. And I'll call this guy Calavera and then click OK. And then armed with a rectangular marquee tool up here at the top of the toolbox, I'll right click inside the image and choose convert to smart object so that I'm applying Super Zoom as a non-destructive smart filter. Then you want to go up to the filter menu and choose whatever command appears at this location. And then, as things stand now, you want to switch to the beta filters and then turn on this guy right here, Super Zoom. Now, you may have to download the filter, but in any event, notice that we have this option right here that allows us to zoom in on the image, and then you can drag inside this little preview here in order to frame the image inside the canvas. All right, now, just so we have a bigger preview, I'm going to drag this vertical boundary right here all the way over to the right so that I'm squishing all of these options over here on the right-hand side. We're still seeing a little preview. And then what you want to do is select the hand tool. It's just going to make it easier as opposed to spacebar dragging, which has a habit of turning these options on and off, at least here on Windows. And I'm going to press Control-0 or Command-0 on the Mac in order to center my zoom. Now notice that you have these various checkboxes. You can enhance image details. You can also enhance face details if you like, which is going to help sharpen some of the details like the eyelashes and these very tiny facial hairs. If you want to smooth the image, then turn on Remove JPEG Artifacts, and that will smooth over the details inside the photograph. You can also sharpen the details if you want to, although that does do a real number on the highlights and the shadows, as you can see here. And then if the sharpen function brings out noise, then you can turn on the noise reduction feature. I'm not going to turn on either of those, however. So I'll just go ahead and turn both of those checkboxes off. I want to output to the smart filter. so that we're applying editable changes, and then I'll go ahead and click OK. And just so you can see the difference, I'll go ahead and press Shift F in order to switch to the full screen mode, and I'll go ahead and zoom in as well so that we're seeing one of her eyes and her mouth. And now I'll press Control Z or Command Z on the Mac to undo that change. So that's the original version of the image. And then if I press Control Shift Z or Command Shift Z on the Mac, that is the upsampled version of the image with an upsampling that's applied entirely non-destructively, by the way, using the new neural filters here inside Photoshop 2021. In this chapter, we'll take a look at what Adobe calls live shapes, which have gotten so much better inside Photoshop 2021, starting with something that you would think Photoshop would be very good at, which is drawing straight lines. And so what we're seeing here is how the line tool used to work inside Photoshop 2020 and earlier. And so what I'll do is switch to the black arrow tool, the one that Photoshop calls the path selection tool, and then I'll go ahead and click on this vector-based shape that I drew using the line tool. And notice that it's not an open path outline, but rather it's a very skinny slanted rectangle. Now, the more frustrating thing was that you used to have to set this weight value in advance of drawing the line. Inside this version of the software, the weight value no longer exists. Also notice that the fill and the stroke affect that slanted rectangle. Now, strictly speaking, you could draw a straight line as an open path outline using the pen tool. And so I'll go ahead and grab the pen tool, and then I'll switch away from this vector-based shape layer down to the background, let's say, here inside the layers panel. And then I'll go up to the options bar and switch from path to shape. And now I'll set the fill to this guy right here, no color. And I'll change the stroke just for the sake of demonstration, let's say to bright red. And I'll increase the line weight to 30 pixels. All right, now all I have to do is click on one point and then click at another in order to create a straight line. And it's dynamic to the extent that I could increase its thickness by raising the line weight to, let's say, 50 pixels in order to create this very thick path outline right here. Well, now you can do the same thing, only better, using the line tool. And so I'll go ahead and bring up the shape tool flyout menu, and I'll select the line tool, and now I'll just go ahead and drag in order to create a straight line. Now notice that by default, that brings up the properties panel, at which point I could just go ahead and increase the thickness of that line even further to, let's say, 100 pixels like so. And we have a true open path outline that responds dynamically to a new line weight. And that, very briefly, is how the new and improved line tool works here inside Photoshop 2021. Now, one of the most exciting things about live shapes in general inside Photoshop 2021 is that we now have what Adobe calls on-canvas controls. And so notice immediately after drawing the line, I have these handles at either endpoint. And so if I want to change the length and angle of this line, all I have to do is drag one of these endpoints like so. Now notice that I'm doing so with the line tool selected, but I could actually have any shape tool selected. So I'll go ahead and switch to the rectangle tool, and notice that I can still drag an endpoint. You can also change the angle of the line without changing its length by moving your cursor slightly beyond one of the endpoints and dragging like so. And notice that the properties panel remembers the angle value, and that's going to become important in future movies as well. The other way to access these on-canvas controls is to switch to the black arrow tool. Once again, Photoshop calls it the path selection tool. Either way, you can go ahead and drag one of these endpoints. I want you to compare that to the behavior of this pen tool line, and so I'll go ahead and switch to that layer here inside the layers panel, and notice even if I click on the path outline to select it, dragging on either endpoint just goes ahead and moves the line to a different location. And so in other words, open path outlines drawn with the line tool are even better than those drawn with the pen tool. All right, I'll go ahead and switch back to that live line layer right there. And I want to wrap things up with a little bit of a warning. Notice if I switch from the black arrow tool to the white arrow tool, which Photoshop calls the direct selection tool, but it has a keyboard shortcut of A for arrow. And I click on one of these endpoints and I drag it to a different location, I'm going to get a warning that's telling me that I'm going to turn this live shape into a regular, that is static path outline. Do I want to continue? Absolutely not. So I'll go ahead and click no, because if I did click yes, then my path outline would behave as if it was drawn with a pen tool. So again, I'll click no in order to reject that change. And so whether you're working with the black arrow tool or any one of the shape tools, you have these on canvas controls when working with dynamic straight lines here inside Photoshop 2021. Now I'll show you how to work with live arrowheads inside Photoshop 2021, but just so I can better tell the story, we're going to start off inside Photoshop 2020, at which point notice that I have this vector-based layer selected here inside the Layers panel. That is the arrowhead itself, which I drew using the line tool. And just so you can see what it looks like, I'll go ahead and switch to the black arrow tool, and I'll click on its path outline. And you can see, as opposed to this being an open path outline with a dynamic arrowhead, it's just a static path outline in the shape of an arrowhead. Also notice that I set the arrowhead at the start of the path outline and that the width and length values used to be measured as percentages of the width of the line itself. So in other words, they're relative. I also set the concavity value, which is the shape of this portion of the arrowhead, to 20%. But notice, if I try to drag the end point of this line, I just end up moving the arrowhead. But here's what's interesting. Even Photoshop 2020 will tell you that you're going to convert the live shape to a regular path outline. Now, back in this version of the software, there were no special live attributes associated with an arrowhead, but Adobe must have known this feature was coming. So I'm just going to click on the No button. And now what I'm going to do is switch to Photoshop 2021. So I'm now in the newest version of the software. I'll once again select the black arrow tool. And now if I click on the path outline, you can see that it's got handles at both of the endpoints. And so were I to drag one of these handles, I would change the angle of that arrowhead complete with the arrowhead itself. So even in the case of your legacy artwork, you'll be able to pull off this feat. Things get even better if you draw your arrowhead inside the most recent version of the software. And so I'll go ahead and bring up the Shape Tool flyout menu, and I'll select the Line tool from the flyout menu. Just so I don't mess up this layer, I'll go ahead and click on the background here inside the Layers panel. Notice that my fill is set to no color, the stroke is red, and set to a line weight of 30 pixels. And were I to click on a gear icon up here in the options bar, I can see my arrowhead settings. And so I'll go ahead and turn on the start option. Notice that my width and length values this time are measured in pixels. So we have absolute values instead of relative ones. And so I'm going with a width value of 50 pixels, a length of 100 pixels, and once again, a concavity of 20%. At which point I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac, and I'll draw a new line like so. Now initially it's going to look as if we're creating a very skinny line, but as soon as I release, I'll see that line weight applied, not only across the length of the line, but across the arrowhead itself. And so now all I have to do to change the angle and the length of that line is drag one of these endpoint handles like so, and the arrowhead goes ahead and changes along with. If I want to change the angle of the line without changing its length, then I would just go ahead and move my cursor slightly beyond the endpoint and drag like so. And the angle of that line is tracked here inside the Properties panel. And so if I wanted to, I could change it to a different angle, such as 135 degrees. That's not really what I want, however, so I'll just go ahead and drag this endpoint like so. And if I like, I can increase or decrease that line weight. I'm going to go ahead and change it to 50 pixels, and notice that the arrowhead expands along with that line weight because the stroke is traced around the arrowhead like so. And that is how you work with live arrowheads, whether you drew them in Photoshop 2021 or a previous version of the software.